Wall Street Journal said very clearly that China had won the first round of the tariff battles. So Apple will pay a price. It would mean some loss of jobs in China's exports, particularly to the United States. But China's got plenty of internal room for maneuver. The growth rate of the US economy since 2007 is well below its historical average. And the US therefore began to turn against globalization. Trump is the dramatic expression of this, particularly his announcements this year, but it's not a process which started there because it is having to de-risk itself from the point of view of what is happening with the United States. But it's not changed in its fundamental system. The fundamental domestic system remains the one which, in my view, is in line with Marx. That is the most socialized part of the economy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, please smash the subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amounts in the link given in the description box. But the least you can do is like, share, and comment. Also check out our Substack where we bring long format analysis. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, John Ross. John is a prize-winning columnist whose work is on China. He is the author of The Great Chess Game. His 1992 study correctly predicted China's economic rise versus the failures of shock therapy reforms in Eastern Europe. With nearly 1 million followers on Weibo and over 200 major articles published, John is an important voice on China. John, welcome to India and Global Left.
Very pleased to be here.
I've been waiting to have this conversation on China, but maybe we should start by hearing your thoughts on the tariff embargo. It was kickstarted by three grand aims of bringing back industries to the United States, which now even hedge fund managers like Ken Griffin is saying it's not very reasonable. Secondly, to compensate for the tax cuts through revenues through tariffs. And thirdly, which I think is the most important, is to contain China. I'm curious how you are looking at this whole economic warfare.
Well, there's two aspects to it. One is this is an attempt by the United States to impose an entirely new trading system on the world. I mean, it's not just a question of China. It's aimed against China. But aimed to do that, it will introduce a trading system in which the United States has arbitrary and unilateral power. Up until now, ever since World War II, there's been a whole series of ways of globalization, but these were carried out through multilateral agreements. Originally, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was written by the United States, and then the creation of the World Trade Organization. Now, this is very far from being perfect. It's got all sorts of problems in it, but nevertheless, it was a multilaterally negotiated agreement. What Trump is attempting to do is a situation in which one in which the United States arbitrarily makes any rule it wants, in which it unilaterally imposes tariffs on one country, changes it if it doesn't like the outcome, etc. And this removes all bargaining power or multilateral bargaining power from other countries. So this is no longer a negotiated international trading system. It would be unilaterally imposed one, and one in which you don't even stick to the rules, because the United States, under the Trump previous presidency, introduced a new form of trade agreement between Canada and Mexico, for example, in North America, which Trump has just unilaterally ripped up. So this is actually a threat to every single country in the world. And that's why I'm pleased to see that quite a lot of countries are refusing to go along with it, not just China. So in a cough, you're going to have to do an edit there. I'm sorry about that. Right. Okay. So that's the first thing. This is a very big threat to every country. And that's why a number of countries which don't necessarily always have the best relations with China see this as a threat. The second thing is it's not going to work. Trump really doesn't understand how international trade works because the trade balance of a country, or besides the balance of payments balance of a country, is just how much capital it's imported with the sign reversed. That means the balance of payments deficit of a country is an import of capital. So what the big US balance of payments deficit means is it's been imported capital for a long time, which has been funding US growth. It's not generally known, and it's a rather surprising fact, but it's true, that at the present time, the US, which is the number one capitalist country in the world, in net terms, produces almost no capital. I mean, 0.8% of GDP. That's once you take out depreciation. So what Trump is actually doing by attempting to get rid of the balance of trade deficit is stop the import of capital into the US. But if that were to happen, then the US economy would drastically slow down. And then the third thing is, of course, it's greatly misjudged from the point of view of the situation with China, because China's, the world's largest exporter, and now, only about less than 20% of China's exports go to the US, so it's not going to really stop China's economy. Therefore, the result of which is what has happened is Trump has created mayhem on US financial markets. I mean, having declared on the 2nd of April that this was one of the most important days in American history, I mean, that's literally what he said. He then abandoned the reciprocal tariffs against everybody except China about 3 or 4 days later. Then he abandoned a number of the tariffs against China, and the situation was chaos. Why? Because there was a danger that the US financial markets were going to spin out of control. The dollar exchange rate broke through the floor, which had been trading in for the last 3 years. The US bond markets went up very rapidly. And Trump had no option but either to see a huge crash in the US financial markets or to make a tactical retreat. So he decided to make a tactical retreat, but therefore the situation is incoherent and nobody knows what's happening. So really what Trump has done is launched a very ill thought out and very dangerous plan, which has now backfired on him. I mean, you don't have to take my word. I mean, the Wall Street Journal said very clearly that, China had won the first round of the tariff battles. It's only the first round, but that is the general view which happens, and it happens to be correct. In order to get the US financial markets back under control, Trump had to abandon a large part of the tariffs which he announced on the 2nd of April.
There is a lot of speculation about the rise of the yield in the bond market. I mean, one sort of discussion is that there are big financial players in the London market who are dumping a lot of these dollar-denominated bonds, leading to a rise in the yield. But the other speculation is that the Chinese, the central banks and central banks mostly, they are selling off a lot of their holdings in the U.S. Treasury. Do you have any idea about what's going on in Beijing about that? Are they using their financial leverage of exporting capital to fight this or defend this attack on them?
I don't have any privileged information, but I think it's all of the above that you put, which is what you're having a sharp reduction in the price of US assets. I mean, the dollar is down, its trade weighted index is now down 10% from its peak, which means you're going to be suffering a loss if you bought near the peak. The bond yields are going up, which means Treasury bonds are going down, and the stock market has fallen by 10%. After all the adjustment actually went down to the worst point and minus 19% compared to its peak. It's now gone up a little bit after Trump's tactical retreat, so it's 10% down. So that means anybody who is holding US assets has lost money. So under those circumstances, I think a very large number of people are attempting to get their money out of the United States. I mean, there's been also reports about Japan doing so in other countries. I don't see any particular sign that China is carrying out a specific attack by China on the United States, but anybody holding US denominated assets or US assets, which, when faced with such a big fall in prices, is going to want to be thinking about getting their money out of it. So that's creating the situation, and that's why, in order to control the situation, Trump has had to make a partial retreat. The problem is, of course, that the partial retreat only lasts for 90 days. So we will have to see what happens at the end of the 90 days, and then the whole process may start up again. Also, the US economy is going to slow down this year anyway, even if we hadn't had the tariffs, because the long-term US growth rate is 2.1, 2.2%, depending on whether you take 10-year average, 20-year average. For the last couple of years, because of the recovery from COVID, it's been growing at 2.8, 2.9%. So it's been growing above trend. So it's going to slow down anyway in order to just return to the long-term average growth rate. And the tariffs have made the situation worse. So therefore, that's another negative aspect of the situation, which is the US economy will slow. And if China hits its growth target this year for 5%, the gap in growth between China and the United States will expand. So the situation on US markets is not terribly good. If you look at the share markets, in recent years, the S&P 500 has been outperforming other countries' share markets. This year, it's underperforming them. So there's a whole series of reasons why you wouldn't want to hold US assets at the present time.
You mentioned about the Wall Street Journal saying that China has won the first round of battle. And I think it's important to discuss a little bit about the strength of the Chinese economy. I mean, obviously, China is in a better situation as far as the capital markets is concerned. It doesn't rely on international borrowing. That was true even in the 90s. In the 90s, in the 2000s at least, it's relied on heavily on foreign direct investment, not all of which came from the West, by the way, very important, because a lot came from East Asia, Taiwan, China, Singapore, Japan, and so on. But it does rely on exporting its manufactured goods. Can you talk about the resilience and even vulnerabilities of the Chinese economy in the event of this a prolonged embargo?
Well, you can see there's a number of things. Let's try to divide China's trade exports down into various categories. The US, the last time I looked at the data exactly, was about 16%. That's annoying. It's not good. China, it would mean some loss of jobs in China's exports, particularly to the United States. But China's got plenty of internal room for maneuver to deal with that. It can directly subsidize firms. It can compensate for their losses. It can help them to make the different export markets. So it's not nice, but it's not going to cause any disastrous problems in the US economy. Right. Then the next thing is the question of, let's call them the global north countries, which are not the United States. Europe is the biggest, but there are a few others like Japan, etc. Well, they don't really want to go along with the US because they're in a situation in which they'll be subject to arbitrary rules. At the moment, they get some protection from the World Trade Organization. It's true that the US has tried to sabotage the World Trade Organization as much as possible by not appointing judges. So it's a partial defense, but at least there is some system there, whereby if the United States can set rules for it just by itself, they're subject to the whims of the United States. And in the case of Trump, maybe he'll decide to have a tariff one morning and get up next morning feeling in a different mood and get rid of the tariff. I mean, they've got no protection. I mean, the talk which is now coming out is from the reports of the media is now they're emphasizing it's better to get a good deal than a quick deal. That's the phrase which I've been seeing. Well, okay, but that means what does that mean? It really means they don't want to set there. Trump is a very sensitive person. They think probably they've got to stroke his ego a bit, but they don't really want to go in a situation with the arbitrary situation. Then controlled by the US. Then you've got what you might call the global north, that's for political reasons the global south, by which I mean countries which are in bad, advanced countries, which nevertheless have got not very good relations with the United States or are highly dependent upon China. The biggest one of those is Russia, of course, which is definitely not at the moment got good relations with the United States. There are some others. Chile, for example. Not Chile has not got bad relations with the United States, but Chile is very heavily dependent upon trade with China, doesn't want to fight with China. And China has made very clear that if you do come to an agreement with the United States to limit hit China's exports to your country, then China will retaliate. So therefore, a country which is heavily dependent on trade with China doesn't want to have a row with China, certainly. And then you have the developing countries, which incidentally now are around 40% of China's trade. They definitely don't want an argument with the United States. And China's normally there, but definitely don't want an argument with China, sorry, because China is their biggest trading partner. So the direct leverage of the United States is not terribly great. It can, I don't want to say it's going to have no impact on China, but it's just not big enough to make a big impact on China's economy. The only question that would be is if all the other major countries were allowed the US to enter a situation in which it unilaterally makes the rules of international trade. But that's not in their interest, and so far they're not showing much sign of going along with it either. So it creates some problems for China, but it doesn't create massive problem. It doesn't create an uncontrollable problem for China. Where it will have probably more damage is in the United States, because the China import, because the US has high technology sanctions against China, China doesn't actually import many things from the United States, which it can only get from the United States. It does import some, and China's loosened, therefore reduced its tariffs on some essential imports from the United States. But in most cases, as many international institutions have noted, China mainly imports things from the United States that it can buy from somewhere else. So it'll buy them from somewhere else. Whereas the United States imports things from China, which it can't get from anywhere else, which follows from the fact that China is, of course, by far the world's largest manufacturing producer. So actually, therefore, the impact is more likely to be painful in the short term on the United States than it is for China.
On the imports, there are some farm products which can be easily substituted. And then on the industrial side, there are the so-called high-tech semiconductors being now discussed a lot. And today, Bloomberg had a huge report on how Huawei, which was banned, initially it was hurt tremendously, but over the years it massively expanded its domestic market, with its new operating system and integrating with electric cars, home appliances, mobiles. Recently signed a partnership with BMW. So it might be the case that as Huawei expanded because of the limitations it was imposed on it, that might be true for other companies that rely on critical imports like semiconductor. I guess on this, my question is, do you have a sense of what corporations like Apple, for instance, who relies heavily through Foxconn on Chinese production, what is their attitude towards this total trade embargo? Of course, we are seeing statements like they have plans now to move or shift production entirely to India by 2026. They have been talking about this for a while, though. What is their attitude? What do you make of these sectors of the U.S. business class?
Well, Apple's own, according to the reports, it's not that China that it's going to shift all its iPhone production from China to India. It's going to shift the part which is exported to the United States from China to India. It won't affect it. Yeah, they will have to divide it because the problem is that India, which is the only place that you could at very large scale, or countries like Vietnam, are just not as efficient as manufacturing centers as China. That means Apple will have to pay a higher price for its product, and it will have a less reliable system because China has far superior infrastructure to India or Vietnam, and it has a very much more trained workforce. I mean, it was very good. It was put by Tim Cook. He explained that the Apple doesn't fundamentally produce in China anymore because it's low wages. It's not low wages, I'm pleased to say. It's because he said, if you look at the engineers which they require, if, the people who are manufacturing engineers, he said we could probably get them into one room in the United States, whereas in China we can fill a football stadium. And therefore I can get problems solved with very much better in China. So Apple will pay a price. So what I think will happen is it will increase the bifurcation which is taking place in the world economy at the present time. I mean, what you see is if you look at the globalization process, the world is not deglobalizing. If you look at the trade levels in the percentage of world GDP, the majority of the world GDP is now traded. What it is the United States is opting out of globalization. And you're therefore going to have two things. You're going to have a fast track world economy whose core will be China and the big developing countries, because India's growing fast, but it's not the only developing country that's growing fast. Indonesia's growing fast, Vietnam's growing fast, Bangladesh growing fast, etc. And China's the biggest, but it's not the only one. So you've got a fast track of China and global South countries that want to grow rapidly and have got no intention of deglobalizing. And the United States, which is opting out of that situation, which means it's going to go into a slow lane and also going to fall technologically behind. I mean, it's ridiculous. The rest of the world is changing over to electric vehicles, and the United States is giving up really producing electrical vehicles to go back to gas guzzlers. Well, that makes it impossible to export, and it will actually be negative inside the United States. And then Europe is sort of caught in a mess because economically it would be much better to go with the global South countries and have more sensible policies, but it's been subordinating itself politically to the United States. But this has created tremendous problems in Europe. I mean, the situation in Europe is very bad. What does it have? Its powerhouse economy, Germany, is basically not growing. The prediction for this year is 0% growth. Why? Because its cheap energy supply from Russia has been cut off because of the NATO expansion creation, the war in Ukraine. So the price of energy in Germany has shot up. One of its biggest export markets, which is China, the United States wanted to have bad relationships with. So Europe has got slow growth, relatively high inflation, and a big war. This is, absolutely terrible situation from the point of Europe. So the economic interests of Europe would be to remake good relations with China, which seems that's one pressure on them, and they're doing things on that. For example, there seems to be a rediscussion to get rid of the idea of having tariffs on China's imports of EVs, and instead China have a minimum price. Well, okay, that means if let's say that an EV in China costs Europe costs $30,000 and it costs $15,000 in China. Okay, if Europeans are prepared want to have more high priced cars than the ones they could get in China, that's fine. But they seem to want to do that rather than go down the tariff road, and things are getting more reasonable. So, and on the other hand, the United States will put on political pressure on the situation in Europe. So you say you've got one track, which is the core, which is China, the global South, big global South countries, and bits of the global North, which is going down a fast track, the US, which is going down a slow track, and Europe, which is sort of quarters and fight in the middle, and it's not totally clear yet what the outcome will be. That's the way I would see the situation.
Do you expect overall global trade to slow down. Of course, it won't contract, but if the United States continue its embargo on China, and if these negotiations with the rest of the global South doesn't go well, would it slow down? And if it does, then my question is, there has been this idea now that China should slowly shift from a surplus export based economy to ramp up its domestic consumption. And that means fundamental restructuring of the financial sector as well, given the banking credit goes into the state-owned enterprises, much less to the household. So there are talks about those things. Do you think that's a healthy discussion, or do you think China should continue the path of export-led growth strategy, because there is a lot of room globally, and there is a lot of room in terms of cost of production in the Western provinces?
Well, there's two questions there. One, what's going to happen with global trade? And secondly, with the China, what's happening in China. So I'll do with both. Okay. Firstly, the US economy is going to slow down this year anyway. Let's say, do a back of an envelope calculation. But back of envelope calculations are frequently very useful, right? Which is the US economy's average long-term growth rate is 2.1 or 2.2%, depending whether you take a 10-year average or a 20-year average. In the last 2 years, because it's been recovering from COVID, it's been growing above that, 2.8, 2.9. So a lot of impressionistic stories writing about the speed of the US growth. It's just normal upturn of business cycle. So it's going to turn down. It's been growing, let's say, 0.6% above its average growth rate. So this year, probably grow 0.6% below its average growth rate in order to even things out. That'd take the growth rate down to about 1.6%. Interestingly, the latest prediction from the IMF is 1.8%, but that's, I would have made the 1.6 not based on the IMF, based on those things. Okay, the tariffs may make the situation slightly worse. There's a discussion in the US about whether there's going to be a recession or not. Maybe there will be, maybe there won't be. It's not the most important thing. The economy will slow down this year, and that will have negative effects on world trade, and that will affect all countries. That will include China. So that's the world economy, therefore, will slow this year, and particularly the US. We'll see whether it's a recession or not. As for China, there's a confused discussion on this, because the discussion takes place as though demand were only consumption, but that's not true from an economic point of view. Demand is both investment and consumption. And therefore, if China wants to reduce its trade surplus, it has to increase domestic demand. That's correct. But it doesn't necessarily have to increase domestic consumption as a percentage of GDP. It could increase its domestic investment as a percentage of GDP. So there's a rather confused discussion which takes place in some of the Western media on that. What will happen on that? I think you have to distinguish two different things. If obviously the US economy slowing down and the tariffs will have some negative effects, and therefore China, I'm sure, will take some stimulus measures during this year. It doesn't need to immediately, because it took a series of stimulus measures in the last quarter. The growth rate in the first quarter is 5.2%, which is very satisfactory. Its target's 5%. So there's no need to do anything at the moment. But let's say my guess would be probably by the end of the year or into the second half of the year, we'll probably need to take some further stimulus measures. In the purely short term, consumption-based stimulus measures can be very effective because they can be introduced quickly. It's relatively easy to get people to spend money. Basically, you just have to cut prices and people will spend money. That's the experience of that. But the long-term strategic question for China is it's set a very definite growth target. That growth target is that it will double its per capita GDP between 2020 and 2035. If that occurs, of course, it will far outgrow the United States, because that means 100% growth in a period in which the US economy will probably grow by 40%. That means it has to hit 4.7% a year growth between 2020 and 2035. So far, it's a bit ahead of target. It's grown at about 5%, 5% a year. To do that, it needs approximately the level of investment it's got in the economy at the moment. It's investing slightly over 40% of GDP. It has to invest 8% of GDP in order to grow by 1%, which is very efficient, incidentally, by international standards. It's all a myth that China's investment is inefficient. The US has to invest 10% of GDP to grow by 1%, and China has to invest 8%. So actually, China's investment is more efficient than the United States. But because it's very efficient, you're not going to be able to increase its efficiency much. So that in order to hit its 5% growth target, China has to invest about 40% of GDP, or slightly over 40% of GDP. And I don't think it's going to cut that. It wants to hit the 5% growth target. So I think you may well have some short-term consumer stimulus, but it's not going to fundamentally change into a Western-style consumer-led economy. Why should it? I mean, if it has the same economic structure as the West, then it'll grow at 2% a year. It won't grow at 5% a year. I mean, it's rather bizarre, the type of discussions in international press which says, oh, look, China's economy doesn't look like the Western economy, which is, of course, true. Look at China's economic structure for 5 minutes, and you'll find out that it's not like that of the Western economy. Why? Because the Chinese economy is growing much faster. It's growing at 5% a year, whereas the US is growing at 2% a year and Europe at 1% a year. But in that case, the problem is not with China, the problem's with the West. I mean, let me take a comparison, because Goldman Sachs likes to write this stuff about how China's structure is different. Imagine you were going to enter an industry and you ask Goldman Sachs for advice, go and look at this industry and tell us what we should do. And Goldman Sachs came back and said, look, what we found out is that one company here is growing much faster than the others. Therefore, you mustn't learn from the most rapidly growing company. You've got to learn from the others. The ones that are less successful, everyone would laugh just before they cancelled the contract with Goldman Sachs. Right? Of course, China's economy is a different structure to the Western economies because it's growing much faster. But the problem is the slow growth in the Western economy. It's not the fast growth in China's economy. So there's no reason why China should fundamentally change its growth structure, because if it has the same structure as the West, then it'll grow at the same rate as the West, which is about 2% a year. So I would expect there will probably be some short-term stimulus, which will probably include consumption, because you get a quick return on that. But it's not China's not going to fundamentally change its model. On the question of the surplus, the last time China had a big surplus, but it was that time was much bigger as a proportion of GDP. What it did was it increased its investment level. And that is why the trade surplus went. I don't expect it to greatly increase its trade. I don't expect it to greatly increase its investment level. It's around 42% of GDP. And that's more or less what it needs to hit its target of doubling GDP per capita between 2020 and 2035. So there's not going to be any fundamental change in its model, because it's just producing a more satisfactory result than is the Western model.
I guess just to ask a follow-up on the investment point that you made. Investment, as I understand, primarily comes from the enterprises who saves a lot. It's a high saving economy based on the enterprise savings, and they invest a lot. And then there is the state-owned enterprises which use its bank and funnel the credit, and they invest a lot. Of course, you're saying that there is no need to ramp up investment by a large degree because it's already high at 42%. But my question is, earlier you said that if need be, if there is a global slowdown and if need be, then it can increase its domestic investment. Would it come primarily through stimulus, or do you think enterprises would also scale up investment? Because I don't think that would happen. Do you?
Well, there's two things. Firstly, yeah, I mean, China has much stronger macroeconomic anti-crisis measures than any Western economy. I mean, it doesn't have a business cycle. I mean, that's the point. I mean, in the West, you have a business cycle. I mean, you get recessions, negative growth. China doesn't get that. I mean, the economy sometimes grows a bit faster or a bit slower, but it doesn't really have a cycle in it. And the reason is because the very large state-owned sector gives it very big anti-crisis capacity. Basically, in China, slightly over 50% of the investment is in the private sector and slightly under 50% is in the state sector. Let's call it 50-50 for the sake of argument. Right, okay. Now, what that means is if there's a downturn, the economy is controlled via the state sector. There's a difference in China. There's a difference. The difference between China and the old Soviet model is the Soviet model is what I would call an administered economy. That means tens of thousands of prices were controlled. All the minute details of the economy were controlled. It was, illegal to sell a pencil at a different price in Moscow and Vladivostok, which is thousands of kilometers away. So it wasn't really planned in overall. It was a sort of administered economy. China once it introduced the economic reforms in 1978, and the socialist market economy didn't have that at all. Very, very few prices are controlled in China. China doesn't. I don't know if there are any prices which are controlled in China. There's certainly no significant number which are controlled in China anymore. Right? How does it control the economy? It controls the economy through the state investment, state sector investment. That is, if the economy is growing too slowly, it will increase the state sector investment, and the economy will grow more rapidly. That's what it did confronted with the international financial crisis. Confronted with the international financial crisis, it ramped up the state investment and therefore it didn't slow down. If the economy is overheated, which is what it did, for example, in 2007, then what it does is it lowers the state investment level and the economy to cool it down. Now, then there's really not a distinction between what the state-owned enterprises do and the state-owned banks and what is the overall system. I mean, let's look at the response. Let's take a big example: the response to the international financial crisis. What happened there in the United States? Witnessing the big slowdown around the international financial crisis, the president says, "Will you please invest more?" And basically, the answer comes from the private sector enterprises, no, politely. Right? That's not what happens in China. What happens in China is that the government decides it's going to increase investment. The banks are giving quotas. I mean, it's not voluntary. That's what they were given in 2008. They're given quotas of their lending. Go out and look for people to lend money to, and therefore the economy speeds up. Now, that's a very big example. I don't think we're going to see a crisis on that scale. But we can see what happened, for example, in the last quarter of last year. The economy slowed down in the second and third quarters of last year. And therefore, what the government did was, in the last quarter, it took some stimulus measures. It carried out, it gave incentives to people to replace their consumer goods. It gave you got a discount if you replaced your car or you replaced your expensive consumer goods. That stimulated the consumer sector. It put up the infrastructure investment, but this is a sort of tweak. It's not like a huge thing which you had in 2008, and therefore the economy speeded up again. So it hit the 5% growth target this year. This is continuing into the first part of this year. The result on the first quarter is 5.2% growth. The target for the year is 5%. So we've gone into the first quarter above the target. As I said, I think because of the tariffs, I assume second or third quarter the economy will slow down because of the negative effect of the tariffs, and the government will then step in with some further stimulus measures. It doesn't need to at the present time because the economy is actually growing above its rate. But the point is that its whole set of anti-stimulus measures, because it has state-owned banks, has a big state-owned sector, is just much, much more powerful than any Western economy. That's one of the reasons why its long-term growth rate is so much higher than the West, because it doesn't have recessions. It's just incredibly stronger from the point of view of dealing with crises, including ones which come from tariffs, and it's due to the structure of the economy.
I think I'll take a step back here and ask you a few, let's say in the language of economists, long-term questions. We more or less focused on the short-term questions. And I think you're the best person to, for me to ask you, um, how would you define, looking back, what China did through the 3 decades of reform? I mean, it's not 3 decades. It started in late 1970s, but I wanted to ask you about the more significant decades from the 90s onwards. What has happened to China? And I'm asking this because a lot of people are confused, including people on the left, that, oh, China became capitalist and, this and that. Can you share your thoughts about what happened from 1990s onwards?
Well, yes. I mean, what happened in the 1990s, basically the economic structures which were carried out in 1978 were opened up, were carried out into actuality. I mean, don't forget that China's reform in 1978 is called reform and opening up. The opening up took place big time in the 1990s. And I'll go into that. Right? Okay. Yeah, you have to go back and look at what China is. In my opinion, China's economy is much closer to the economy analyzed by Marx than was the Soviet economy. If you look at, again, let's be very sort of scriptural and look at what Marx said. In the Communist Manifesto, he said that the working class would use its political power to take capital control of production out of the hands of the bourgeoisie by degree. Note the by degree, not all at once. Right. And secondly, if you take the critique of the Gotha program, Marx is very clear that market relations, particularly market relations as regards wage labor, are going to exist in the first period of socialism. Now, what happened in the Soviet Union in 1929, which was taken as the model of socialism, was something different. Control of production was not taken by degree. In 1929, with the first 5-year plan, virtually everything was nationalized. I mean, right down to, your local corner shop and your barber shop and all this type of thing. Now, in my opinion, this was necessary, but it was necessary for geopolitical reasons. It wasn't necessary for economic reasons. It was because the Soviet Union correctly believed it was going to be militarily attacked. And therefore, it had to give total priority to the building of military industry. And to create military industry, you have to create heavy industry. Therefore, everything had to be subordinated to the construction of heavy military industry. And after 1933, it not merely knew it was going to be attacked. With Hitler's coming to power, it knew by whom it was going to be attacked. Right. And this policy was successful. How do we know it was successful? It won the war. It was a war economy and it won the war. Therefore, we can say that was successful. But this introduced economic distortions because in order to pump the resources into the heavy industry, you had to have complete control of prices, you had to have the total collectivization of agriculture, you had to have the nationalization of more or less everything. And that wasn't the taking control of production by degree. But it was correct. I agree with it. I lived in Russia for 8 years, and all my Russian friends would say, and I agree with them, well, we won the war. Everything else is a detail. Now, however, after 1945, and particularly after the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons and could defend itself, a different problem arose. It wasn't, in that case, a 10-year period before we're militarily attacked. It was how to engage in decades-long economic competition with the West and developing the economy. And then the weaknesses which were produced in the Soviet economy by the extreme nationalization of everything and the administration of everything, et cetera, turned into strategic weaknesses. The difference was and what I think it should have done, let's say roughly in the 1960s, was to have introduced a Chinese-type economic reform. I mean, if you look at how I became involved in China, I actually started. It wasn't an interest in China. It's a question of economic theory and the international economy. I first studied the Soviet economy in 1972, and I thought, from the point of view of economic theory, it was making, although at that time it was relatively successful, it was making some fundamental mistakes. Which were against Marx's idea of socialism as the socialization of labor. It was attempting to create a self-contained economy that cuts you off from international socialization of labor. It nationalized everything, essentially, and therefore that wasn't an organic socialization of production. That was something imposed from above, particularly the collectivization of agriculture. Now, I don't want to claim brilliance or something. I just thought these were theoretical observations, and I spent about 1% of my time thinking about them, to be truthful. But in 1978, China began the opening up of its economy. It decollectivized agriculture. So I thought, from my theoretical understanding of economics, this should be very successful. And if it wasn't very successful, then my understanding of economic theory was wrong. So I'd got to change my ideas. So either way, I better start paying some attention to the situation. By 1981, it was clear that it was successful, so that solved that problem. Right. But at that time, relatively, China wasn't opening. There was a great deal of reform going on. The big opening up started in the 1990s, and that was done very consciously. The key question was the devaluation of the currency, because China had maintained a high exchange rate up to the beginning of the 1990s, and that meant that its exports couldn't be huge, etc. From the 1990s onwards, a conscious devaluation of the currency took place, and the huge export boom of China began. That is, the opening up became not merely a slogan, the opening up became a real economic policy. And that really carried through until 2007. And I think that was correct. At that point in time, the world economy was globalizing. China adopted itself to the fact that whereas the Soviet Union in the 1930s had been confronted, the world economy had disintegrated. This was the period of protectionism, Smoot-Hawley Act, the British Empire ramping up the tariffs and all that type of thing. In the 1930s, China adapted itself to the globalized economy. That's what the opening up part of the reform was. But of course, in 2007, a new crisis hit, which is the US economy has not recovered from 2007. The growth rate of the US economy since 2007 is well below its historical average. And the US therefore began to turn against globalization. Trump is the dramatic expression of this, particularly in his announcements this year, but it's not a process which started there. The process started earlier in 2007. The US economy is the 2007 is the fourth great international crisis in the United States, fourth great historical economic crisis in the US. I won't go into the previous three. One was obviously the Great Depression. Right. And so the US is now opting out of globalization. Now, the question is, will the United States succeed in disintegrating the world trading system? That comes back to something we discussed earlier, which is, will the US replace some sort of multilateral international trading system with one which is unilaterally controlled by the US? Under those conditions, China has to place more emphasis on what it calls security. China is bringing its supply chains back within China. China is consciously deciding that the priority is being given to the domestic economy. It's not cutting itself off. It would like the globalization to continue. That would be better for everybody. It will be better for China. But it has to prepare for the risk that the United States may succeed in disintegrating the world globalized system. And therefore, China is now carrying out, it's not a closing down. Purely technically, it means that the percentage of China's trade in its economy is falling. That's for two reasons. One is because China is a much, much bigger economy than it was in the 1990s. And in very large economies have a smaller percentage of foreign trade in their economies. So the percentage of trade in China's economy is falling, one, because it's just got much bigger, but secondly, because it is having to de-risk itself from the point of view of what is happening with the United States. But it's not changing its fundamental system. The fundamental domestic system remains the one which, in my view, is in line with Marx. That is, the most socialized part of the economy, that is the very big enterprises, is owned by the state. I mean, what does the word socialism come from? It comes from socialized. What it means is the big industrial sector should be socialized, but your small shops and your medium enterprises and agriculture don't need to be socialized. That they're artificial. So therefore, the Chinese economy was so successful because, in my view, and if you read Marx, its economy is closer to Marx than was the Soviet economy, which is not, I'm not criticizing the Soviet economy during the 1930s. I think it was necessary, but it was necessary for geopolitical reasons. That was misunderstood, however, as a general economic model by the left, and that's just a mistake. So it's a slightly complicated issue to discuss, but that would be my summary of the situation.
This is so interesting. Listening to your assessment of the Soviet Union, and I don't disagree at all. I was constantly thinking about Maoist China because there was the self-contentment. It was not open to international economy. Then there was the constant threat of militarism against it, which meant all the same kind of things. Escalating industrial production, large sector driven by the need to rapidly build up its military, and not just the set of major institutions being socialized or nationalized, but a complete elimination of markets, and then the collectivization. So I suspect your assessment of China, of course, there are differences. I mean, the Soviet Union was much less surplus labor. China was, of course, had a much greater reserve of surplus labor. So I think in a comparative scale, we have to take into account those things. But my question is, would you have very similar assessment of China from 1949 to 1978?
Yes, I think there's two. The way I would the way I would put it is the following: China under the Mao period created a social miracle. I mean, I'm very careful. When I wrote my first book that was published in Chinese, I'd studied China mainly since 1978, and I wanted to go back and look in with a very open mind about the 1949 to 1978 period. And looking at that, I didn't quite agree with some people's assessments in China. They place great emphasis upon the fact that the Mao period saw the laying of the foundations of industry in China. And that's true. I mean, China couldn't produce heavy trucks, so China couldn't produce investment goods, etc. In 1949. I mean, in 1949, China was almost the poorest country in the world. The data shows that only 10 countries in the world had lower per capita GDP. So it did lay the foundations of industry, and that I agree with. But that wasn't the most striking feature of the Mao period. The growth of China was about in line, very slightly faster than the world average. What was incredible in the Mao period is the social improvement. I was absolutely blown away by this. I mean, depending upon the estimate,
healthcare, education, housing in urban cities.
Yes, and the result. Yeah, the result. I mean, the best indicator of overall social conditions is average life expectancy, because it takes all the positives, good healthcare, good education, high income, no pollution. It takes away the negative ones, poverty, pollution, bad healthcare, etc., and produces you a single number. It's like the human body acts as a computer. Is the situation good or bad? And it tells you by its life. Well, China's life expectancy went up by nearly 30 years during the Mao period, in a period, of less than 30 years. It's unbelievable. I mean, it is the fastest increase in life expectancy in any major country in human history. And therefore, we know what created this. It was the village doctors, the village teachers, the emphasis right on primary education. It's incredible. I mean, if you take periods which historically known for rapid improvement of social conditions, there's Britain in the second half of the 19th century, after it overcame the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution, Japan following World War II, but China exceeds any of these. I mean, under Mao, you lived about 30 years longer than when Mao came to power. Now, leave aside the question that he got the foreign troops out of China. He got the developed China's economy. If somebody leads you to live 30 years longer, you tend to feel very well disposed towards them. And that was a social miracle, I would say, during the Mao period. If you look at the economic policy, yeah, it was based upon the idea that China was going to be militarily attacked. So that, for example, a lot of the industry was developed on inland China, where it was more expensive to develop it, because that would be safe. If China was invaded, that would be safer. And that was Mao's estimate of the situation. Now, once the economic reform was launched in 1978, this was very explicitly on the view that they believed that a period of some decades of peaceful development was going to be possible. Deng Xiaoping is very explicit. He says the only thing which would lead us to reverse the economic policy, that is the reform and opening up, would be the threat of war. And therefore, China's assessment of that international situation was correct. I mean, not that there were no crises and not that there were no regional wars, but it was not confronted with a direct military attack upon China. And that was a correct assessment of the situation, just as the Soviet Union's in the 1930 opposite conclusion that it was going to be attacked was a correct conclusion. You can't take an economic decision independently of what you consider to be the economic, the geopolitical conditions, because it leads to different priorities. Because China was a developing country under conditions of peace, it could give priority to labor-intensive, consumer-orientated light industry, which could grow very rapidly because it doesn't have the investment requirements of very, very heavy industry. If it had been wrong, if there had been a military attack on China, well, then it would have been hopelessly unarmed for the situation, just in the way that the Soviet Union's distortions in the 1930s, which were distortions in the economy, were justified by the fact that it pumped the resources into heavy military industry. So you have to look at the situation from that point of view. So, yeah, in 1978, there was a change in that situation. If you look at the situation now, China's emphasis is, it still considers, to use Chinese terms, that the main trend is peace. It is not orientating itself on a big, there's going to be a major war between itself and the United States, but it has to emphasize the question of more of security more. So it's put in more resources into, for example, its own R&D and chip field. I mean, it knows it's going to be attacked on that. I mean, the United States is attacking it on its high technology. So China's got to put resources into that. But it has to take more precautions under conditions in which it thinks that the main trend is still peace. That's it. So there's different assessments of the international situation under the Mao period and under the post-1978 period, and therefore different economic priorities which went with that.
I'm coming to an end, but if I could quickly ask you about your thoughts on this whole talk about inequality in China. And I think it's mostly prominent along two lines. One is the division between the coast and the western provinces, and there are different calculations, but roughly per capita income would be 2 to 3 times between the two halves. And the second is the rural urban divide. Of course, it must be said that the Chinese rural population has shrunk dramatically. I think the latest figures are about 17 to 18%, depending on how one defines it, because there are some ambiguities based on whether you consider social securities or so on. But it is also true that the rural has not been able to grow at a pace that urban China has. What are your thoughts about concerns around inequality in China?
Well, there are two things. One is I don't think it was possible for China to grow in an purely equal way. I mean, because of the investment resources, to industrialize and to develop a country the size of China is not possible to do it all at the same time because the investment resources would be impossibly large. I mean, it's one of the reasons why China developed the special economic zone, for example, which is you you can't put modern China couldn't possibly develop modern infrastructure throughout the entire country all at one time. It's just impossibly expensive. But what you could do is in certain geographical areas, you could put in first rate infrastructure. And that's what the special economic zones were. And then these special economic zones were very good from the point of view of exports. They were very good for production, etc. So the regional inequalities were a result of that. You industrialized and grew fast where it was quickest to. And then that helped bring the whole economy forward. But now you're beginning to see the situation going in the opposite direction, both in rural sense and in a geographical sense. I mean, if you look at now the rural in the last few years, the rural incomes have actually been growing faster than have been the urban incomes. That's a big process of rural revitalization. And also, the emphasis has been shifting significantly into the western, that is, the inland parts of China. I mean, I was this week in Chongqing, for example, which is the big. For those who don't know where it is, it's a big inland city, very well connected to the sea by the Yangtze River, but the sea is still thousands of kilometers away, right? Okay, it's being used as a big hub from the development of manufacturing. I mean, Chongqing is the world's largest producer of laptops. It's the largest producer of cars in the world, and it's an inland city, and it's got the fastest growth rate in China at the present time. And again, Chongqing has been taken as a special model. There are three cities in China which are under the central government directly, which are Beijing, Shanghai, and Chongqing. And Chongqing was deliberately chosen now because it's an inland city. And its big development is being used as the pivot to help develop the inland sectors of China. But again, even if you look at the Chongqing area, the rural development is taking place at the present time more rapidly. Rural incomes, are going up more rapidly than the urban ones. And this is exactly to address this question of inequality. You had a few years ago, about a decade ago, you had the introduction of the concept of common prosperity. This was basically saying, things had got, we were not in favor of people driving around in Ferraris and all this type of thing. That was not what socialism was about. The inequality had got a bit excessive, that's the truth. And therefore, you had the concept of common prosperity, which is that everybody had got to get better and we had to reduce the inequality. And then this is particularly developed into the rural revitalization. One of the things which is very clear is to see the role of the CPC within this, because this process is being led directly by the CPC. I mean, there were some wonderful examples in Chongqing. The local CPC's party secretary, his job is to go and get a better type of mustard seed, in order to help the villagers increase their income, etc. So those questions are being overcome. But also, you've got to place this within a general context. China's had the greatest improvement in poverty reduction of any country in the world. Over 850 million people were raised out of poverty by World Bank standards. That could only be done by rapid economic growth. Then it finished off the last 50 million by very targeted programs. In some cases, it had to move whole villages and so on because it was too expensive to put the infrastructure to very, very remote places. So it relocated villages and all that type of thing. So now the situation in China, particularly both as regards the regional areas and as regards areas, is very much to develop China in a much more equal way. And that's a very conscious policy of the government. And as I've indicated, as shown by the rural incomes growing more rapidly than the urban ones, this is having some considerable success.
My final question, John. There is a lot of talk about cheap labor, which is just bullshit, if I may say, because real wages are sharply risen by all indicators I have seen about China. So I wouldn't even ask you about this. Maybe you can tell a little bit about that narrative. But what I want to ask you is that there are people on the left who say that the political power of the working class in China declined through the high growth years. And they say that that is precisely because they have relied on market mechanisms. Do you think it's a correct assessment to say that the political power of the working class has declined? And or do you think that that's not even a relevant question given it's been an economic miracle in these years?
Oh, it's a very weird question because, I mean, the income story is just completely opposite the truth. The China has by far the most rapid growth of real wages in the world. I mean, if you look at the International Labour Organization study, my memory is right, it's almost twice as fast as any other country in the world. So it's a very peculiar situation in which the working class is supposedly losing power, but its wages are increasing incredibly more rapidly, right? I mean, it's absolute nonsense. I mean, what is happening in China at the present time is a huge increase in, firstly, in poverty elimination. Okay, we know that a large part of poverty was in rural areas, so it wasn't. We should probably say it's an improvement position of both the workers and peasants, because a lot of the peasants have gained out of this situation. But it's the rapid achievement of the workers and peasants, and from the point of view of wages, it's the most rapid growth in the entire world. And also, you're getting at the present time, the big expansion of the health system and so on and so forth. I mean, what is happening is also you've got to be quite clear what is being produced at the present time in China. I mean, this is a massively more sophisticated working class in terms of education, etc. in the world. It's very important. Marx did not define workers as those people who got their hands dirty. I mean, a lot of people got their hands dirty or workers, but it's people who sell their labor power. And of course, you've now got vast sections of people who are regarded in China as, national heroes. And what are the people in Huawei who produced the incredible recovery of Huawei? The Americans tried to smash the mobile phone business of Huawei. It's been rebuilt now by replacing the US chips in 3 to 4 years. Who did that? It was the workers which did that.
Also, it's operating system. Also, it's operating system. The Harmony operating system. It's like it's challenging Windows and Mac.
Yeah, exactly. They did destroy the Americans for 3 years. Well, no, the Americans in one go, by depriving Huawei of Android, destroyed Huawei's mobile phone business. It was completely destroyed. It took 3 years to rebuild it. Who did that? It was the workers who did it. Let's take another example. DeepSeek. I mean, DeepSeek, as the AI, has had a shattering effect. I mean, it lost NVIDIA $1 trillion in its stock share market capitalization, in 3 days. And it's shaken the whole AI system because America believed that it was going to retain absolute leadership unchallenged leadership in the field of AI. And China instead has come in and produced something which is as good as ChatGPT, but it only costs 10% of the price. This is shaking the whole world economy. Okay, what are these? These are certainly highly skilled workers, but that's what they're workers. It's not capitalists, billionaires, the people are producing this. So therefore, the working class in China now is certainly, there are still a lot of people getting their hands dirty, and there are people who are the most advanced technological people in the world. But that's the power of the working class. I mean, you've got to be serious. I mean, I do that. But what was Einstein? Einstein was a highly skilled worker. That was his proper social definition. He worked all the time, his entire life for a wage. And therefore, you've got to understand that. China is creating one of the most advanced technological societies in the world. And it's basing itself on what is the working class in that. That's what's making it this breakthrough. This is absolute triumph. I mean, these people are, the workers in Huawei or the workers in DeepSeek are regarded as national heroes. And they're quite rightly regarded as national heroes because it's made the point. If you go back to the great grandparents or the great grandparents, what the national recovery of China required at that time was that you went out and fought the Japanese. You went out to the countryside, you took your rifle, and you took a very great chance of being killed in that situation. And I mean, tens of millions of people were killed. And that was what your country required you to do at that time. Now, what it requires you to do is go and get an engineering or mathematics PhD. Go and develop your technology. Or as you put it even more funnier, people say to boost the consumption, what it really wants the country needs you to do is go and take a holiday. Go and stay in a hotel. Go and spend some money. So there's a joke, how easy we have it, compared to the people who had to fight for our national development in the past. But there's no point in romanticism. You have to do whatever your country requires to do at its present stage of development. They can be very glad that what they do is the best way they can serve their country is go and become a highly skilled worker, and they don't have to go out with the rifle and fight the Japanese, right? That's the great progress of the country. But that's an achievement which is being carried out, by the working class in China, and it's getting the benefit of it. And it's just silly leftist nonsense. If let's be serious, if capitalism were capable of producing for 40 or 50 years an increase in living standards and wages, which is trying 4 or 5% a year, then capitalism is still a progressive system. Socialism is a utopian fantasy. But it's not capable of doing that. And therefore, everybody should be inspired by the examples of what is happening in China. I mean, China has gone in 1949 to being almost the poorest country in the world to being almost on the brink. A couple of years, it'll become a high-income economy. That's in 70 years. What the world should want is for the whole of the rest of the world to have the same success as China. I mean, the number of people who live in high-income economies is 16% of the world's population. China is 18% of the world's population. When it becomes a high-income economy by World Bank standards, which will be in a couple of years, it'll more than double the number of people who are living in high-income economies in the world. That's an unbelievable achievement. My God, what an achievement for socialism, right? But 2/3 of the world population still won't have achieved it. What it means is the next step, China is the big step that can be taken now. But then what happens is the rest of the 2/3 of the world has to have the same achievement of China, and then many of the world's problems will be solved. And that's what the left should be understanding. What an incredible step forward for humanity it is. And it shows that socialism works. That's the lesson that people should be taking from China.
We'll leave it there, John. It's such an exciting, China is such an exciting place to think about anything. But of course, you think about the economy a lot. So do I. So my question just never stops. But we need to stop. I have to be respectful about your time and my viewers' time. But it has been an incredible privilege and pleasure. And I think this is just the beginning of more further collaborations with you. Thank you so much.
I very much hope so. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.